Hi there, and welcome to your first recorded lecture for the CPS 101 class. I'm Daniala Weir, and I would have met you in the introductory lecture. I'm an assistant professor in the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Clinical Pharmacology. I'm your course coordinator, your examiner, and I'm going to be your teacher for certain portions of the course. And you can take a look at the schedule to see which lectures I'll be teaching. So today I'm going to be giving you a lecture on the drug life cycle, just a quick overview to get you used to what we're going to be talking about in the rest of the course. It's just a quick overview, essentially, of the entire course and what we're going to be covering. So don't worry too much if you have questions about different sections, you want a bit of additional detail. We're going to go into each of these sections in detail in the rest of the course, and you'll also probably go into a lot more detail on different parts of the drug life cycle in different parts of the CPS program. So yeah, this is just meant to be a quick introduction. And if you have any questions along the way, please remember to note them, and you can post them in Microsoft Teams on the discussion board. And we can also talk about it during the drug life cycle seminar. So let's get into the lecture here. So essentially, what we're going to talk about is the whole drug discovery, drug life cycle sequence, where we look at the steps where you bring a new and how you bring a new medication onto the market. And essentially, it's called the drug development pipeline. So first, what you start off with is drug discovery. So you screen a bunch of compounds to see which ones might have potential for treating whatever condition you might want to be treating. Then you start off with doing some preclinical studies, and for example, different tissues and maybe animal models to look at preliminary effects with respect to whether the medication works or not. Then you get into the clinical trials, which includes phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 studies, which are typically done in humans. Then if a medication has been shown to be safe and effective, then it goes on to be approved for use on the market. And then after it's been approved for use and it's being prescribed by physicians, then we get into the post-marketing drug surveillance phase. So that's just a quick overview of the entire drug development pipeline. And I'm going to go into each of these sections in a little bit more detail now. So this is just another quick overview of the drug development pipeline. So essentially there's the preclinical phase where compounds are being screened to see whether or not they have potential to treat a condition of interest. The clinical phase, which again is the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So here on the side here, we see a legend related to, this is from like a drug company perspective, earnings, expenditure, and sales. So earnings is when a medication is making money, then expenditure is when a drug company is spending money, and then the sales is after a medication's been approved for use on the market. So we can see that there's a huge investment with respect to money when a drug company is trying to bring a medication to market. So essentially the screening, a lot of money spent on phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials, then a medication is approved for use in the market, and then it's physicians start to prescribe the medication, and then the sales of the medication increases, and then eventually it declines. And that's another way to look at the drug discovery pipeline from essentially like a manufacturer drug company perspective. So what are some of the costs associated with the development of new medications, and what indicates whether a medication is going to be successful in the drug discovery process? So, as I mentioned, pharmaceutical companies or drug companies have to register newly developed medications, which requires clinical studies and safety tests. So we need to make sure that a medication is effective and it's safe before you bring it onto the market. But the likelihood of having a medication approved really varies. So if you have an entire, set of compounds that you're screening to see if it has potential to treat a particular condition that you're interested in, the success rate can vary from 24% to less than 10% for drugs used to treat cardiovascular conditions or GI conditions. So, you might start off with about 10,000 compounds in the drug discovery step. And then after 10 years, where we're going through the whole drug discovery pipeline, the preclinical, clinical, post-marketing surveillance, you might end up with one medication that's actually stays on the market 10 years after that. So it takes about 10 years for a drug company from the initial screening phase until it's actually brought onto the market. And as you can see in the previous graph, it costs a lot of money. So drug development costs about $16 million to up to $2.6 billion. And it really depends on the medication, how much it costs to actually bring a drug to market. So it takes a lot of time and effort from the initial screening phase to actually registering the medication and having it brought onto the market. So I'm just going to give you a quick example to put some of this into context and make what I've been saying so far a little bit more concrete. So for example, rofecoxib was a medication whose brand name was Vioxx. So this medication was a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. It was an NSAID. That's the medication class it belonged to. And the subclass it belonged to was a COX-2 inhibitor. It's a selective cyclooxygenase 2 inhibitor. So this medication was an anti-inflammatory medication. It was an analgesic. So anti-inflammatory, analgesic means it's used to treat pain, and it's an antipyretic, meaning it's used to treat fevers. So its mechanism of action is that it inhibits prostaglandin synthesis, via the inhibition of COX-2, which is then responsible for catalyzing the formation of prostaglandins, and that's how it has its anti-inflammatory, analgesic, and antipyretic effects. Its indication, so these are the conditions that this medication is used to treat. It treats osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, as well as acute pain. It came in a suspension, a capsule, and a tablet, and it was taken orally. So when they're going through the drug discovery process for this particular medication, what can help guide this process is to kind of guide which compounds a drug company would want to screen to see if it might potentially treat the condition of interest, as it can be related to new insights into the mechanism of a disease. So you might start looking at chemical compounds which inhibit the progression of the disease. And that's where you start off by screening thousands of different chemical compounds based on what you know about the mechanism of action for the disease. Then you might get into your preclinical research after you've narrowed down a few different chemical compounds that have the potential to treat whatever condition you're interested in treating. So this includes in vitro and in vivo studies. So this can be, lab-based work and also in animal models. So in these types of research studies or preliminary studies, you really want to understand, how a particular chemical compound of interest is absorbed, how it might be best administered, the best route of administration. So whether it should be taken orally or it should be a drop that goes into your eye. You need to sort out those sorts of things. You want to know how it might interact with other medications. So if a patient is taking a bunch of other medications in addition to this new chemical compound of interest, you want to know whether it interacts with that particular medication. You also start trying to determine and conduct studies to determine what the drug does to the body, and this is called pharmacodynamics. And you also want to figure out what the body does to the drug, and this is called pharmacokinetics. And in their preclinical research, you also want to determine what the starting dose for human clinical trials is. So this preclinical research section, we're not going to get into a lot in CPS 101, but you're really going to focus on this in a lot of your other CPS classes during the course of your program. So I'm not the expert in this type of research, but you will become the expert in this type of preclinical research throughout the course of your CPS studies. So after the preclinical research phase is completed and we have some of the answers to our questions related to, how the or new clinical compound might work in the body and what the right dose might be for that particular clinical compound, then we get into phase 1 clinical trials. So these are the first tests of our chemical compound or potential medication in human subjects. So these trials are typically characterized by treating about 2 to 100 healthy volunteers with the medication. These phase 1 trials typically last several months, and the main objective is to determine the safety of the medication. So you want to understand what the physiological effects of the medication are on the body. You also want to understand the pharmacokinetics of the medication and then what the maximum tolerated dose is for the patient or for the individual. So an example of a phase 1 study in our rofecoxib or Vioxx example were studies that assess the mucosal integrity through the GI tract after use of the medication. And this was conducted through a fecal occult blood loss outcome in 67 healthy male subjects. So that's an example of a phase 1 clinical trial that was conducted for rofecoxib. So after the phase 1 clinical trials are complete, then we move on to the phase 2 clinical trials. So in this particular, phase of the clinical trial process, there's an increase in the number of individuals who are treated with the study medication. So now we're going to treat about several hundred people. And this is very important. It's among people with the disease or the condition of interest. In the phase 1 clinical trial, we were just looking at healthy individuals, and in phase 2, we're actually treating individuals with the disease in order to see the potential effects of the medication. So the study timeline for this particular clinical trial phase is a little bit longer. It can be several months to 2 years. And the purpose of phase 2 clinical trials is to determine the efficacy and side effects. So when we see the term efficacy actually means what we want to determine whether the medication works to treat whatever condition that the compound is supposed to treat. So that's efficacy. And side effects are related to whether or not a medication causes adverse events, unintended adverse events that are outside of what we'd expect for that particular medication. So just to put it in context, an example of a phase 2 trial with rofecoxib was a 6-week study which evaluated differences in signs and symptoms of osteoarthritis. So the indication for treatment is osteoarthritis, and so we're determining whether the medication has efficacy. So efficacy is related to reductions in joint pain, stiffness, and tenderness, and this was compared to placebo. So phase 2 clinical trials are sometimes compared to placebo and sometimes they're not. It depends on the specific type of clinical trial, medication, and condition of interest that's being studied. So those are phase 2 clinical trials. Now moving on to phase 3 clinical trials, and we're going to get into a lot of detail on phase 3 clinical trials later on in the course. So this is really where the details or the time is spent in CPS 101 at the beginning, and you're really going to get a lot of details on how to properly conduct a phase 3 clinical trial. But just as a quick overview to start off with, phase 3 clinical trials include an even greater number of subjects as compared to a phase 2 clinical trial, and we study about 300 to 3,000 volunteers who have the disease or condition. The length of study is 1 to 4 years. And the purpose is to determine the efficacy and monitoring adverse drug reactions, but these are always placebo-controlled trials. There's always going to be a placebo or a comparator group in these particular studies to compare to. So they're larger trials, they have a longer follow-up period, and there's always a comparison arm that you're comparing your particular study medication to. So that's important to keep in mind. And about 25 to 30% of medications move on to the next phase after this. So after a medication has been shown to be have efficacy, so it's effective in treating whatever disease the medication was initially intended to treat in the first place, and it's relatively safe, meaning that there's not too many side effects associated with the medication, then a drug company can submit a package to a regulator. And yeah, if a drug developer has evidence from its early tests in preclinical and clinical research that the medication is safe and effective for its intended use, then the drug company can file an application to actually market the drug, meaning that it can be prescribed to patients by physicians or other healthcare providers within a particular setting. So the regulator tends to be organizations such as the European Medicines Agency, the Food and Drug Administration in the US, and Health Canada in Canada. And this is a team that reviews all of the submitted data from the drug company, and then it makes a decision to approve or not approve the medication for use in a particular patient population or a particular market. And Helga is going to get into the specifics of the regulation process in one of her lectures. So they're going to see a few more details on this particular phase of the drug development pipeline a little bit later. So after a medication has been approved for use by the regulator, then it's up to a government or a health insurance organization or a healthcare organization to make a decision with respect to whether they're going to cover the cost of a medication or to what extent they're going to cover the cost of a medication. So to give an example, if you have a private insurance company, then the insurance company itself would make the decision with respect to whether it's going to cover the costs for the medication for, all the patients that are enrolled in its plan, or only for particular patients that are enrolled in its plan. So that's one particular scenario related to reimbursement decisions, and this can also happen at the government level. So in a lot of different countries, medications are covered by a government organization. So then they also need to make decisions with respect to whether or not they'll cover the cost of a medication for a patient, or whether it's only within specific patients, or what the details are surrounding that. So that's another important next step related to in the drug discovery process after a medication has been approved for use by the regulator. So after the medication's been approved for use and reimbursement decisions have been made about the medication, then we start with our phase 4 post-marketing drug surveillance studies. So these studies are very important and occur after the medication is available for use and on the market. So these studies look at the ongoing safety and effectiveness of medications in the real world clinical setting. And this is really important because previously we'd only studied the safety and efficacy of a medication within a clinical trial setting, which can be a little bit of a different situation than the real world setting, because in the real world, patients aren't randomized particular treatment. They're prescribed medications by clinicians based on their characteristics, and the patients who are in randomized clinical trials might differ a lot from patients who are treated with the drug in the real world clinical setting. So that's why it's really important to continue monitoring the safety of the medication after it's been approved for use in the market. So again, we want to continue to monitor the safety of medications once they're out on the market, due to some of these limitations of randomized controlled trials. So, randomized controlled trials are designed to answer a very narrow hypothesis in a very small patient population. And we might, and there's lots of questions that arise in everyday clinical practice that, an RCT might not answer for a clinician when they're trying to make a prescribing decision in the real world clinical setting. So if a specific patient population's been excluded, then we might conduct a phase 3 post-marketing drug surveillance trial to look at the safety or effectiveness of the medication in that particular patient population. A safety outcome might not have been measured in one of the randomized controlled trials. So let's say, there's interest with respect to whether or not a medication might have cancer as a side effect, and that can be studied in a post-marketing drug surveillance study because it likely wasn't studied in the initial RCTs that were used to get the medication approved for use on the market. Also, like combinations of medications typically aren't looked at in RCTs, and different comparators aren't always studied. So observational studies or phase 4 post-marketing studies address these knowledge gaps without exposing patients to additional experimentation like you do in RCTs, because in these studies we use pre-existing data that's collected from, for example, electronic medical records. So we're going to get into a lot more detail about phase 4 post-marketing studies later on in the course. So you'll get a few more details on that, but it's just important to understand their place in the whole drug discovery pipeline. So moving on to, what are some success factors for the success of a therapeutic or a new medication that's been brought to market? So put very simply, a medication has to meet some basic criteria. It has to be a quality medication, it has to be safe, and it has to have efficacy. So efficacy, again, meaning that it has to treat the condition that it's initially meant to deal with. It has to be safe, meaning there's not too many side effects. Additionally, a drug has to be cost effective. Typically, if another medication's on the market that's also safe and effective, the only way that it's going to be approved for use is if it's also cost effective. And a drug must fulfill a need or create a need. So, you can't just have a new medication that's approved for use that doesn't actually fill a need, because a prescriber is not really going to prescribe it. So those are some basic criteria for how a therapeutic might be successful in the real world clinical setting after it's been approved for use. And the schematic just shows a quick overview of the different stakeholders and relationships in the pharmaceutical market. So this is the regulatory agency down here and the insurance company. So the regulator makes decisions about whether or not a medication is approved for use on the market. And insurance companies or governments typically make decisions about whether a medication is reimbursed or how a medication is prescribed. So this is the pharmaceutical industry here. So it typically interacts with the regulatory agency. It also interacts with, all these different sectors. So this is the wholesaler, which produces the medication. This sector here is the pharmacy sector. So this includes hospital pharmacy, community pharmacy, and maybe some other types of pharmacies, and then the prescriber. So who's actually, prescribing the medication to a patient, and then this is the patient here. So as you can see, these are all very interconnected sectors which interact with one another and also interact with the regulatory agency and insurance companies. So, the drug discovery pipeline has a lot of important stakeholders in it, which are involved in taking a medication from the drug discovery process all the way up until it being approved for use on the market, and then it actually being prescribed to a patient in the real world clinical setting. So it's also kind of interesting to think about, after this whole process occurs and 10 years of investment and money have gone into this, why might an investigational drug die, or might it not be successful? Well, there's a lot of different reasons for this, but typically this is, we determine this in phase 1 to 3 clinical trials, and a medication will not be successful and won't be brought to market if it's found to be toxic, it's insufficiently effective, meaning it doesn't actually treat the condition it's meant to treat. It has too many side effects, so the risk of the side effects far outweigh the benefits of whatever the treatment is.
If there's applicability challenges, so it's difficult to formulate a dose, so there's some pharmacokinetic problems related to the medication, and if there's insufficient market potential. So if there's another medication on the market that's already, essentially treating what this new drug is meant to treat, then it might not fill a particular need. And even if it's approved for use on the market, prescribers might not, or physicians might not actually prescribe it to patients. So those are reasons that an investigational drug might not be successful. And then again, of course, in phase 4 studies, if a new side effect is found for a particular medication or adverse event that outweighs the benefits of the medication, then that might be a reason to withdraw the drug from the market. Oh, and this is why marketed drugs die, right? So this is in the phase 4 post-marketing drug surveillance phase. So as I mentioned, there's an unexpected side effect. The risk of a side effect far outweighs the benefit. There's a new medication that comes onto the market that might be better. And then, of course, there's economic and political reasons why a medication that's already been approved for use on the market might not actually be successful or be prescribed to patients. So this is just a quick little example of a particular medication, essentially the drug discovery process or drug life cycle for this particular medication. It's an anemia drug. So this just shows, the time period from the approval of this anemia medication. It was approved by the FDA initially, then it's approved for another indication over here. Then there were claims that the medication improved the health-related quality of life for patients. So that's when the sales of the medication started. But then later on, I think that there were findings that the medication actually didn't improve health-related quality of life for patients, and then there were label changes related to saying that the medication shouldn't actually be used in cancer patients, which is a large market for this particular medication, since that's the patient population that it's typically meant to treat. And then that's why the medication kind of fell out of favor. So I went over that really quickly, but that's just an example of a few key events in the life cycle of this particular medication, from its initial, approval for use on the market, and then all of the events that happened during the course of its use, and then its decline in use in around 2010. So yeah, just a quick overview of a life cycle of a medication. So that's the end of this particular lecture. And again, please note any questions that you have. You can ask them during the drug life cycle seminar, and you can also post them on the message board in Microsoft Teams. So thank you, and I hope you have a great day.